And we're going to pick up in Leviticus chapter 25. So this is our second Wednesday service back in person. We're glad to have everyone. We're glad for everyone who's watching online as well, or watching at a pre-recorded at a different time. So we're going to go back to the year of Jubilee. We started last week looking at the personal benefits of the year of Jubilee, the whole system. And again, this is so different. It's so unusual outside the box to what we're expecting and what we experience in our lives. So in the Bible, their year of Jubilee system, they would have a cycle of 7 years. They were supposed to plant their crops and grow their food on the land for 6 years, and then in year 7, they were to let the land sit empty and lie fallow and give it a break. And so that's the sabbatical year, and also any debts would be forgiven there in year number 7. And then when you have 7 sets of those, so 7 times 7 is 49, so year 50, the year after 7 of those 7-year cycles, year 50 is going to be what they call the year of Jubilee. And that is just a kind of a resetting of everything, that if there was anyone who was in debt, a bond servant, they had sold future years of their labor, they would be set free early. And also any land that had transferred use or title with it, that would be reset to the original family. So kind of just everything sort of going back to how God intended for it to be there after the time of Joshua. So we looked last week at the personal benefits, how just like God puts in the Bible, the 1 day out of 7 needs to be a day of rest, a day to kind of take a break and kick back and pull away from the hectic things of life. Similarly, he put that in for a year, that 1 year out of 7 needs to be a year of rest and something for us to just kind of not get so caught up in the rat race of how our life is. And you see that, especially even young families that Katie and I noticed a couple years ago. It used to be families with kids and stuff. It was kind of more about previous generations, like, oh, my kid got this award or got this scholarship. That was kind of the scorecard for life, who got this trophy or whatever. And that it's still sort of that way, but now the scorecard for life is how busy you are. Of like, well, my kid does football and wrestling. Well, my kid does football and wrestling and track and dance, and and that's you see it. You see all these families are just running around to all these different things, but that's what they value. That's busyness is the scorecard of things with that. Well, the Bible is all like, let's just take a break from that, pull back. We need rest for our bodies. We need rest for our souls, and we need to see what that would do for us. So that the personal benefits, we looked at that last time, how families would come back together, tribes would stay united. And so then we're going to look here this week, and next week we'll look at what that would do economically if all debts would be forgiven every 7 years, or the land would reset every 50 years. Huge, monumental changes to how our society functions. So we'll look at that the next 2 weeks. We'll look after that at the neglecting of the year of Jubilee. There really isn't any record in the Bible that they followed it, that they obeyed what God had said to do with this. And then lastly, at the end of the month, we'll look at the spiritual pictures of how Jesus connects with the year of Jubilee, how he sets us free from sin, and a lot of things in there, the spiritual pictures with that. So we don't think, usually with the Bible, we think of like, well, this is, God gives us the truth of how people that believe in Jesus are supposed to live in the Bible. And yes, that's true, but do we ever think, well, the Bible tells your banker how he's supposed to function and how he's supposed to treat people? We don't think about your mortgage lender, how he's supposed to treat people, your politician, how he's supposed to spend or not spend his money. But yet it has those things. It has those things in there. The Bible is the authority, the spiritual authority on everything in life. And even it tells bankers how they're supposed to act, and help businessmen how they're supposed to act and things. And yet we get away from that. And I admit I went to Bible college, studied the Bible my whole life, so I'm not an economist. This is not my strong point or anything. Unfortunately, though, my economic knowledge is probably greater than the majority of our people in Congress, unfortunately. So I'm just a preacher. What do I know? But, those guys, they can't even do elementary level math. It's sad. It's really sad. We spent $3 trillion more this year than we took in. Oh, who cares? Who cares? But yeah, it's now Katie's dad, Pastor Tommy, he has taught economics on a college level in the past. And so I did send this to him a couple weeks ago before I taught it, like, hey, can you look over this for me? So he did say this checks out, so it's not completely off base with these things. So well, it has been professor approved there. So what are some benefits of, and this is, some of these things are going to sound, there's a lot of critiques of our current system. You know, we think we have capitalism in America. It's actually a little bit modified than that, but it's going to be a lot of critiques of our current system, how God's way is better. It is better in a lot of things. And I'm not being critical of capitalism. However, God, he has to put, there's some necessary limits to things. You know, the capitalism has its abuses and things that we're seeing people taking advantage of it. And God's system, it doesn't do away. It's definitely capitalist in its basis, but it puts the restraint on there to prevent the worst things of society, the crony capitalism, and they're just taking advantage of people like we see so much. So some of the benefits we'll look at here economically. One is that their crops would do better. That was not the main reason God gave this for them. The main reason so they would rest and the reminder of God's ownership of the land, but it would help their crops do better. And so this is before, in Bible times, they didn't know about crop rotation. They didn't know about adding fertilizer back in. They didn't know about testing the soil for nutrients and the balance of nutrients and those things. You know, we have the knowledge of those things today, yet even today, many farmers will still just let the land have a year off every now and then just to give it a nice benefit. And it can be more productive than to, that's sort of what some parts of the South, they would just grow cotton every single year and never add anything back, and it would burn out the soil, and you wouldn't be able to grow anything later on. And so that's why God gave this to them, that every 1 year out of 7 to let the land have a break, and then in year 48, well, year 49 would be one of those sabbatical years. You'd give the land a break, and then year 50 would also be a break, so it would get 2 breaks there in a row. And so just a lot of benefits that go with that. Another benefit, there are huge economic implications. Think about this when you go to the ballot box, is this would take care of the poor. This would honor the poor there, that God is not at all against helping the poor. In the Bible, over and over and over about the benefits of personal generosity, that people need to remember the poor, remember the widows, remember the orphans, remember the fatherless. Over and over and over, the Bible talks about it. He that gives to the poor lends to the Lord. What the Bible does not talk about or does not promote is government entitlement of everyone just getting a free ride at taxpayer expense. It's all about personal. When you give something to somebody one-on-one, there's some empathy that develops there, you know, that they would have a natural gratitude toward you. But when everyone just gets free hands out from the state, it's an entitlement attitude, and it's a completely different thing that goes with that. But God's system here is to take care of the poor. So in the year of Jubilee, or in the 7th year, the sabbatical year, they were not to grow any crops, but there's going to be some wild crops that are going to grow. There's going to be fruit trees and various things, but also just some seeds that were left over from the previous year. Anyone who's grown a garden before, you'll notice that, oh, I missed this cucumber, or I missed this potato from last year, and a few things spring up, even if you don't plant anything the next year, some stuff manages to pop through. Well, that's what would happen in that 7th year. Some crops would come through, some seeds they had missed the previous year. And so God tells them to leave that for the poor. So the people who own the land, they were supposed to store up in year number 6, and they're to live off their stores and their supplies, and then whatever grew on its own in year number 7, that's to be there for the poor. We see this here, Exodus chapter 23, verse 10. It says, 6 years you shall sow your land, gather in its produce, but in the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. So they were not to harvest anything, but leave that for the poor people. Now, during the other years, during years 1 through 6, what they were supposed to do is they would plant their crops like normal, and they would harvest, but they were supposed to harvest in a circle. So if you got a square field, most fields would be square, maybe not perfect square, but relatively square. You were to harvest in a circle, and you were to leave the corner sections for the poor people. And it may not have been a perfect circle. You know, they may have shaved off a little more than that, but that's a relatively big percentage there. But leaving the corners, that's what Leviticus 19 verses 9 and 10 says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of the field. So that in the normal years, when they are growing crops, leave those corners for the poor. Neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of the harvest. Thou shalt not glean thy vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of the vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. So that was there for the poor people. And that's what we see in the book of Ruth, that Ruth is there following Boaz's men, his harvesters, as they're gathering in the crop. And she would gather in the corners. And then Boaz he's noticed Ruth and noticed her situation. He even tells his men, hey, you guys leave a little extra for Ruth there. Even don't harvest as much as you normally would. Even let's move the line over a little bit and only harvest this section. And so we see what this would do. So God is very much for the poor people, and the people who own the land. They're definitely leaving. This is about a quarter of your income of your crops. They're leaving about a quarter every year, 25%, 27% there. For the poor people there, that's a haircut. They're going to take, that's what they could have profit. If all they cared about was profit, they would take that for themselves, and a lot of times they did, but they were supposed to leave that there. And if they did, God would bless them more so. But we see God, he does care for the poor people, and he wants them to be taken care of. But look at the system. What's the beauty of this? Well, what do the poor people have to do? They have to get out of bed, and they have to go to the field. They've got to cut down the grain or the barley or whatever it is. They have to take it home. They have to grind it into the corn or the flour or whatever, and then they have to bake it. There's work. Imagine that. There's work that's connected with these things. So God is always for people having a way to survive and people having a way to eat, but there's always work that has to be involved with that. That's what we see in the New Testament. What the Bible says, he that 2 Thessalonians 3:10, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat, neither shall he eat. So the Bible is all about helping the poor, but in a system where they have to still work, they have to still get out there and be, and surely a productive landowner, if he sees some poor people out there that are working like machines, harvesting the corners, he's going to want to hire them. Hey, you did a great job. Why don't you come work for me next year or something? There would be a blessing for those that were willing to work. There was always a way for them to be taken care of. And so it would change so much about what our society is there. But those politicians who claim to want to help poor people, they don't want to help poor people. They want to buy votes is what they want to do, is the reality of that. So if they cared about helping the poor, it would be completely different with what we see. But we also see here what this would do economically. This would be a society. You'd have a whole society of people who know how to save money. This is something we lose, even just the recent couple of generations, that even 2 or 3 generations ago, everyone had to learn how to save just to survive. Just any part of being in a agricultural society, you're going to harvest in the fall, and then you've got to have up enough to last you through the winter to survive, and you've got to save some back to plant in the spring. Everyone knew how to do that in the past, but now in our modern world, we have no concept of that. And we just go to the supermarket and get whatever we want, no matter what season it is. And so you got people who they spend everything they make. They spend absolutely everything, and they have no concept of saving. People like that in the past, they would die. They would starve. But here our modern conveniences, you got a way to get by with this. And so Leviticus 25, verse 20, saying, and if you say, so God's telling them, hey, in year 6, I'm going to bless you with double enough to last you through to year 7. And that's a huge step of faith, to not plant those crops in year number 7. I'm going to give up a chunk of my income, and are we going to have enough to eat? Is God going to provide? That's a very big test of faith, certainly. But God says to him, verse 20, if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, since we shall not sow nor gather in our produce, then I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, and it will bring forth produce enough for 3 years. You shall sow in the 8th year and eat old produce until the 9th year. Until its produce comes in, you shall eat of the old harvest. So they had to get enough in year 6, not only to last them all through year 7, but until the crops were coming in year 8. It takes a couple months for those crops to grow. And so had quite a bit of forethought and thinking. And so people are going to learn to save money, and they're going to learn to get by with less. It's sort of like people who grew up, or people who were kids during the Great Depression, had a different outlook on life, and they knew how to stretch a dollar quite a bit more than modern people who've not known how to go without. And we get these things that people, they just spend everything they get. They have no concept of how to save money whatsoever, and that's how our government is reflected in that. We got politicians that not only they don't spend everything they make, they spend everything they don't have. They spent 2 or 3 generations of the future of the taxes is what they've already spent. And so it's like, but that's just a reflection on how the majority of the people are. We're the ones that vote them in, and they're just acting on how everyone else does. Another thing this is going to do economically, huge implications, that this is going to align with the business cycle. So you're going to have 6 years of planting and of growing, and that's what also labor would be connected with that people could hire themselves out. If they lost their land, they could hire their labor. They could hire out future contract bond servant, and so that's called. Some translations use the word slavery, but that's not quite accurate. Bond servant there, and so all of that's going to go in. The maximum a person could do that for would also be 6 years, and so everything's going to have a 6-year cycle to it. You got 6 years growth, and then 1 year off, and then 6 years growth, 1 year off, and then every 50 years also kind of have a bigger cycle. Every business has a cycle that goes to it. Again, I'm a preacher. I'm not a business person, so I don't understand all of the things about this, but everything has its ebbs and flows. So oil does really well. Oil companies, man, the price of oil goes up, and we start drilling, and we start making new wells, and start fracking and offshore drilling and all these things, and then what happens? You get too much, and oil crashes, and all that. Oh, it's the end of the world, and it goes down, and gas prices go down. They're shutting down wells, and people get laid off, and then guess what happens? The price of oil starts ticking up again, and it goes up, and we're opening new wells, and things are looking good, and then it ebbs and flows. It goes up and down. Every single business has that, whether it's agriculture, whether electronics, whatever it is. Everything has its ups and downs with that. And so with what God is imposing here with this rotation, 6 years of working, year number 7, take a break, that's going to line up really nicely to where the whole society is going to kind of be growing, economically growing together, and then we're going to take a year off, kind of contract a little bit, and then we're going to grow together, and it's going to benefit everyone. It's going to smooth that out. Whereas instead, what we have in our modern system is the government steps in and says, we don't want anything to go down. We want things to go up to infinity. And so the government artificially puts its hands on the scale to make things go up crazy. And so you get this thing called a bubble, where things just go astronomical. And so you get a bubble, and then what happens to the bubbles? They burst, and you get a crash. That's what we have over and over. We have bubbles and crashes, and people, at the great times, man, people buying new cars and taking out extra loans on their houses and buying boats and upgrades and all the granite countertops, all these things. They get all the fun toys, and then it collapses, and tons of people out of work. And that's why we have bubbles and crashes, If instead they would withdraw, and we would go by God's plan, instead of having bubbles and crashes, we would just have a nice, smooth there. It wouldn't be so harsh, and it wouldn't be so rough with that. And so that's what we see. And politicians, they try to use, and they're the ones responsible for it. Federal Reserve policy, interest rates, various things. They cause the bubbles and they cause the crashes, and yet they try to use all these words to confuse people. Well, is this a recession that we're in, or is it a depression? And that's what even coronavirus. So what are we in with corona? Are we in a corona recession? Are we in a depression? What's the difference between a recession and a depression? Okay. What does it matter they're the ones that caused it in the first place? If they would just step out of the way. That's what I like Ronald Reagan's definition there from 1980 campaign of recessions when your neighbor loses his job, depressions when you lose yours, recoveries when Jimmy Carter loses his. And I remember watching the video. I was born in 87. I was born in 87, but I remember watching the video clips of Reagan in 1980, in the crowd, and landslide victory and things there. But yeah, so that's what, so the government will hold interest rates down at absurdly low levels, so that way they can borrow and spend beyond their means like crazy. 23, going to be $26 trillion in debt by the end of this year. And so the interest on that is so astronomical. They have to keep interest rates way below what the market is would normally have them at. And so when they do that, people borrow like crazy. Everyone's refinancing their house, getting in at 3%, getting in some people getting in at 2% or even below 2%, 1% and something. And so what happens, that pushes the price of real estate way up, and you get a housing bubble. That's what happened in 2008. Everyone and their brother was getting in houses, and people who didn't even have any kind of income or whatever, everyone's getting a house and borrowing money, and then it bursts, and then it crashes, and it comes down. Why did that happen? Because the government kept interest rates way too low and made houses they made mortgages too affordable for people, and banks gave loans to people who had no job, no income, and no assets, ninja loans, and gave here, let's give you a $450,000 house, person who's homeless on the street, and see what happens. And that's exactly crashes. And so God's system is going to prevent, instead of having massive crashes and huge unemployment and everything collapsing, we're just going to have that nice smooth business cycle. Instead, we're not going to suffer near as much that goes along with that. And so, and we see, what does the Bible say here? Leviticus chapter 25, verse 14 about, so if you know year number 7's coming up, we're going to take a break from the land. That's going to affect everything. The prices, crops are going to get more expensive as you get closer to having that year off. They're going to be really cheap in year number 1, and then year number 2, they're going to be a little more expensive, year number 3. And so by the time you get to year number 6, crops are going to be expensive as people are trading because they're wanting to stock up because there's not going to be any new crops for year number 7. So does God tell the government to step in and control prices? And no, he says, let the market ride. Verse 14 says, and if you sell anything in your neighbor or buy from a neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. It means take advantage of one another, force price controls or be a crook and steal from people. According to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your neighbor. According to the number of years of crops, he shall sell to you. According to the multitude of years, you shall increase its price. According to the fewer number of years, you shall diminish its price, for he sells to you according to the number of years of the crops. So everything would just fall into line. Crops and labor would become more expensive, getting close to year number 7. Loans would be less expensive because the loans are going to get forgiven. And so you're going to have to borrow, and then it would become more expensive right after. So everything is just going to fall into place. We don't have to have this tons of government regulations and agencies and everything. Just the free market is going to take care of itself. If people know everything's going to reset in year number 7 or year number 50, then the prices will adjust naturally, and it will be okay. People will survive. They'll be just fine, and they'll get through it. And then we also see with this massive implications. That would completely restructure our whole way of life if debts were forgiven every 7 years. I mean, how long is your mortgage for? Most people get a 15-year mortgage or a 30-year. 30 years is the most common thing. In the Bible, 7 years was the maximum. The same thing. How can our government have 23, soon to be $26 trillion in debt? It's because we give them 10-year debt treasury bonds. We give them 30-year treasury bonds. Some workers at the Federal Reserve are even talking about, let's add a 50-year treasury bond. You're not even going to be alive to pay off those things yet. We'll borrow money for the next 2 generations in the future. They can worry about it. Let's kick that can down the road. They can worry about it later on when everything's coming to a crash. But no, 7 years, that was the biblical limit. Does your banker follow this? That was the biblical limit for how people were supposed to give loans. And so we see this, Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 1. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts, or sometimes that 7th year, that sabbatical year, that's called the year of release. And then the 50th year, the year of Jubilee on top of that. And this is the form of the release, verse 2. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his brother or his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. That's important, the Lord's release. It's not, you don't need to think of it as you're giving a break to the poor person who has borrowed money from you. You are, in a sense, but don't need to think of it that way. It's the Lord's release. You need to think of it as, I'm giving this as a gift to the Lord, and God is going to honor me in return for this. And so we see also this is how labor was connected. Verse 12 there in Deuteronomy 15. If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and served you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. So this is what is called in many translations of the Bible slavery, even though it's very different from slavery like we think of it. This is not a racial-based slavery. This is a debt labor-based contract, really is what it is. You're going to work for 6 years. It's very similar to signing up for the military. You join the military for 4 years usually or more, and they can do whatever, but they're going to keep you fed, send you wherever in the world, but they'll give you a place to stay. And so you're giving 4 years of your life for having all your needs taken care of. Very similar thing. If they got into debt and they lost their land, they could rent out their land, lease the number of years of crops they had until that next 50th year cycle. And then even beyond that, even if they were still in debt, they could sell themselves. They could sell their future labor, 6 years of labor they could hire themselves out for to someone else and work during that time. And so, but then there's an end to it. So this is not slavery like we think of American slavery of African Americans and cotton fields. It's not a racial-based thing. Anyone could be a bondservant in Bible times. The Jews would buy the labor of other Jews there. So anyone could be a slave, or Romans, Gentiles, or whoever it was, they could be that. But there was a definite end to it. It's not a permanent thing that, you're just a slave because you're black or whatever. No, it was a debt thing. And once that debt had been paid, then you were free. But your children, it didn't pass on to the next generations. That's not how it was supposed to work. And so we see here, though, that they're supposed to set them free. And so there's a limit. There's a 7-year limit to loans for land, renting out crops and things. There's a 7-year limit for labor, and that's it. And so how on earth could you get $23 trillion in debt if 7 years was the limit of it? You couldn't. It'd be impossible. And that's what we get. We get all this debt just piles on and piles, and there's no resetting of it or anything. When was the last time the government even made a dent in its debt? Anybody remember? Bill Clinton, 2 years we had a surplus, not saying that he was a great president or anything, but just there was 2 years we had a surplus, and they didn't even put any of it toward the debt, and that was it. I can't even remember beyond that when the last time the government spent less than it takes in. It just doesn't do that. 40 cents of every dollar the U.S. government spends is borrowed, a lot of it from China, and we wonder what the things are and why things are happening like they are. And so 7-year limits to debt, that's going to put a realistic ceiling on the thing. Society, it's very easy for debts to get out of control in society. Interest, it compounds and it compounds and compounds, whereas people can only grow. Addition is how they can make labor work. And so debts are always going to take off faster than people can produce, and debts are going to get to the place where it collapses society. And you get to the point where people are working their lives and most of their labor is going toward paying interest. Instead of using their labor for buying actual stuff or buying goods and services, they're paying interest to banks, to credit cards, to whatever. Debt becomes too big for society to handle, and then you get a burst and you get a crash that comes in with that. Also, we see in the Bible with this, debt had to be based on collateral. So debt could either be made upon land that you had, or you could get debt upon labor. And that was it. You can't just create debt out of thin air. Banks can today. Used to be, there used to be this thing called the reserve ratio. Like a bank, every dollar that bank has, they have to keep a dime, and they can lend out 90 cents. That is gone. The Federal Reserve is banks can create as much money as they want to. They can just print and print and print, or they don't even print. They just punch it in an Excel spreadsheet nowadays and just make it up. What's the difference between $1 and $1 trillion? $1 trillion. 12 zeros on a keyboard. I mean, that's all. They don't print it even out of a physical printer. They just punch 12 zeros and, hey, we got $1 trillion on our balance sheet. Free money for everybody. And inflation is what you get with that. And so you can't have money just come out of thin air. Money has to be based on something. And that's what so much of the next, what a lot of economists think the next crash is going to be is in student loans. And the thing with student loans is there's no collateral for that. You can't, after a person goes to college and gets a ton of debt for college, you can't return that education. You can't, you get a car loan. If you default on that, they can repossess your car. You get a house loan and you default on your mortgage, they can kick you out of your house and they can take there's collateral for that. There's no collateral for student loans. And what a lot of young people unfortunately find out too late is student loans cannot be erased by bankruptcy at all. There is no way to get rid of student loans whatsoever. And so that's with you your entire life. The average young person coming out of college has $30,000 in student loan debt just to start out life. They're digging in the hole to get out of that. It takes them years before they can even start a family, buy a house, all the things we need to have a successful society. And so, but there's no collateral, there's no equity. Biblically, that's you wouldn't be able to make that kind of loan in the Bible because there's no way to take it back. There's no basis for that there. And so, what we have of course, the government is in debt to astronomical levels, but even companies that are making incredible amounts of money, they borrow a lot as well. It's called leverage. And so they think, well, yeah, we borrow this money because money is so cheap because interest rates are so absurdly low. So we're going to take tons of money. We're going to borrow it from all these banks. That's what companies like Apple that make exorbitant profits, huge profits every quarter. And yet you look at how much do they have in bonds, how much do they have in debts? They got millions of dollars in debts out there. Why? Because they borrow that. They think, well, we can, money is so cheap, we can borrow more, we can be more productive, and that can give you a little bit of an edge in your profits. So maybe if your profits normally would be like 4%, if you borrow and leverage up, you might can stretch that up because you're using other people's money. You might can stretch that to 10% profits on the same thing. That's the good side of leverage. But the bad side of leverage is when there's the slightest little downturn, it magnifies that downturn into a tsunami of destruction. So while you might be making 4% and leverage borrowing gets you up to 10% profits, instead, if there's a downturn of 4%, now that same leverage is against you, and it's not 10%, it's like 25% losses. So what you normally have like a 4% downturn, you get a 25% because of this debt. The debt magnifies everything hugely. And so that's what every single company on the S&P 500 or the stock market, they're in debt up to their eyeballs because the good times will never end, and we got the punch bowl of money from the Fed and all these things going on. And yeah, that's great while stock prices are going up, but if there's just the littlest little change in anything, then it just magnifies the losses. And that's why everything, oil prices dipped or this dipped or job losses were greater than expected. It just sends everyone to a panic because the debt is so huge and everything there. And so that's why we keep having, y'all ever heard of these things? We're having a once in a lifetime crash. 2008 was a once in a lifetime crash. .com in 2001, that was a once-in-a-lifetime crash. Coronavirus is a here I'm only going to be 33 the end of this month, and I've lived through like 4 once-in-a-lifetime crashes. Lucky me. But that's what it is, because these crashes are so bad because all the debt, so much debt magnifies everything, whereas biblically, there's a limit to that. You got to have a reasonable limit. Give loans based on property that people own or labor they can perform, and that's it. None of this other absurd levels of debt, lengths of debt, crazy things that go on with this. And so, yes, they were to forgive that, and there's some Bible scholars that say, well, this every 7th year, it wasn't really a forgiving, it wasn't really a writing off, it was just a suspension. You just got a year off of making payments, then all that debt still picked up in year 8. But that's not actually what the Bible says. They're supposed to forgive it. They're supposed to write it off. Verse 7 is quite clear on that. Deuteronomy 15. If there is among you a poor man of your brethren within any of the gates in your land which the Lord your God has given you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your poor brother, but you shall open your hand wide to him, willingly lend to him sufficient for his need, whatever he needs. Why? Because, verse 9, beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart saying, the 7th year, if I loan to him, it's year number 5, and if I give him a bunch of money, he's not going to repay it. I'm going to lose out. I'm going to lose out in year number 7. The savvy lender is not going to do this. But beware, God says, beware, the 7th year, the year of release is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry out to the Lord against you and become sin among you. You shall surely give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for the thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your works and in all which you put your hand. So, all to which you put your hand. So, faith on the part of bankers. What a tough sell for that. Not only do the farmers have to have faith to not plant in year number 7, but the bankers have to have faith to not rip people off, but to lend and be willing to write off these loans in year number 7 and have the faith that God is going to bless them enough to make up for the loans that they write off. there, and that's why it's called the Lord's release, because if the people don't deserve it, but if they give it to the Lord, maybe they'll have the heart enough to do that. And this is, did the bankers do that? No. That's why we have zero record in the Bible of them actually following this. They just didn't have the heart to, can't lose out on that money, can't do it. And so we just don't have any record of the year of Jubilee actually being practiced as God said, and God punished the people quite severely for neglecting that, and they suffered because they disobeyed God. But that step of faith on the part of the farmers, that step of faith on the lenders, they just couldn't do it. They didn't have that much faith. Don't have much faith. I can go to church a little bit, and I got faith to praise God a little bit. Boy, I don't have faith to let God control my pocketbook or take a loss or anything. Not that much faith. Not that much faith there. So that's what we see. Our whole economy is built around the fact, the idea lenders must not lose money under any circumstances. That is absolutely our whole economic system. If you're in court for any kind of bankruptcy, anything like that, what's the term the courts use? They use the term sanctity of debt. Sanctity of debt. This debt is sacred. This debt is at the level of God's word. Sanctity, sacred, that's the words the Bible uses. Sanctity of debt. It is at divine levels. This debt must be owed, and it must be paid under any and all circumstances. And that's what we see. Our whole society is built around that. And what happened in 2008, tons of people borrowed on their homes, too much debt there on the mortgages because the interest rates were too low. But not only did a lot of people borrow on their homes, tons of people took the equity out of their homes. They got home equity loans. And so you got your regular mortgage and you got your home equity loan on top of that. So you got tons of equity and all. And yeah, while the prices were going up, it was great. And people were buying boats and getting kitchen remodels and all the add-ons to their home and buying Ferraris and toys. And yet it crashed. It burst. But not only what happened to the lenders who were foolish and irresponsible enough to give them that money? Did they get hurt? No, because they got bailed out. The government stepped in and said, we're going to bail out banks. Lenders cannot lose money under any circumstance. That's what our whole economy is built around that. Yes, ordinary people, yes, they borrowed too much. They got foreclosed on. But the people who were irresponsible loaning them the money, the people who had, left all, it used to be kind of thing like you would check, hey, does this person have a job? Do they have income? Do they have assets? Have they paid their bills on time? They used to do those kind of things. But, we're just going to give people houses for nothing. But did they have to pay for their irresponsibility? No, they got taxpayer bailouts and we're too big to fail. We're going to talk about that next week. We're too big to fail. And that's what it is. If we fail, it'll bring everything down. Yeah, right. And so, but that's what it is. So they got tons of money. They were fine. The lenders were taken care of. The people were kicked out on the streets. And that's why, and I'm not defending the people who are out there tearing up towns and things like that, but there is a legitimacy to some of people's frustration of, occupy this or that, or people are a little ticked off for reasons. And things that go, they feel like the system is not working for them, and that's because it's not. The politicians, it's like that nothing is getting done for the people because they don't work for the people. They work for the bankers, and they work for the companies that give them campaign contributions. That's why is nothing getting done in Washington? They're not working for you. They're not working for me. They're working for their corporations, and they're working for the banks that pull the strings behind everything. And so we see that term. Economists use this term called moral hazard, where if you don't pay the consequences for doing dumb, irresponsible things. That's what banks get tons of free money. They do irresponsible things. They should have gone bankrupt and suffered the consequences, but instead they get taxpayer bailouts and prop-ups. And we're seeing the exact same thing happen in coronavirus. Airlines who give ridiculous bonuses to their CEOs and don't give raises to their employees and the main thing they do is buy back their own stocks to boost their stock price. They get tons of loans from the government. They should have gone bankrupt. They should suffer the consequences for their action, but instead we get moral hazard, where you can be irresponsible and you can do really dumb, economically and financially unsound things, and you don't suffer the consequences for that. And these same people just keep getting more money and making the same mistakes over and over again. And there's a lot of people that are just like, I'm done. I've had enough of this. I'm done with it. Occupy, burn it down, whatever. They're just tired. They're tired of supporting the system that is rigged for those at the top. Absolutely. And so that's what we see throughout society. That debt accumulates and compounds, and it gets too much for the people to be able to pay back. And so you have to have politicians who are willing to side with the people and not side with the bankers. And that's very, very rare to ever see. It did happen a couple times. We'll look at that. Hammurabi in Babylon, he did it. The Gracchi brothers in Rome, they tried to do it. Most of the time when a politician tries to do that, the bankers assassinate him. That's what happens most of the time in history. And so that's what Julius Caesar, he was trying to do that. He got assassinated, various ones. So we'll look at those things. And so there's always this tension in society. Do people have the right to support themselves and to take care of themselves, to own enough to be self-sufficient? And that's what the land reset every 50 years. You could not have your land permanently taken away. It would go back to your family every 50 years. So that right to take care of yourself and be self-sufficient, there's a conflict between that right and then the lender, the banker's rights. They want the right to get control of that land, and not just get control of it, but to kick you off of it and to take ownership of it to themselves, to transfer the title and to make sure that title transfer is irreversible. That's what the year of Jubilee, every 50 years, that would reverse the land, the ownership of the land would go back to the original families. But so much of our society, you can't do that in our society. When you sell it, when your name is on the title of something else, there's no way for the person to get it back without purchasing it back there. So everything about our modern system for the lenders, the sanctity of debt, our system is built to help them out. And so, again, we would see everything would just adjust naturally. If we were under God's system, it would be so much better. Prices would take care of themselves. We wouldn't have this outrageous levels of debt that just make everything worse, that make all these once-in-a-lifetime crashes happen. And we wouldn't have, we'll talk about this next time, but we wouldn't have debt and the irresponsible things of one generation pass on to the next generation. No, thank you, $23 trillion in debt for the young people, or for my kids to pay off, or for someone else. Yes, thank you, previous generations for all of that. But it would reset. It would reset, and wouldn't go too far to destroy the things that happen there. And so that's a tough sell, and that's why we see in the Bible they didn't practice it. They would halfway follow it just a little bit, and then they would see, hey, we're going to lose some money doing this, and they would go back to the way things were. And so it's sad. It's sad, and it's sad as we see all the brokenness around us. And again, God is not saying burn the whole thing down. He's not saying go to communism. That doesn't work. But he's saying we put some limits here, some limits on the lenders, some limits on the farmers, some limits on how much people can get in debt, limits on labor contracts. Put some healthy limits there. It's going to be way better for everyone. But yet, we're completely away from that. We think we got a better system than that now. So we'll pick up next time looking at some things here. What would this do to the middle class? That's what we're seeing in our society. The middle class is getting destroyed quickly. The rich, they're doing fine. The poor are growing like crazy, but the middle class is shrinking. That the year of Jubilee would do so much to restore the middle class, would do a lot to protect small businesses. Who's losing out the most in Corona? Small businesses. Walmart, how many days have they been closed? 0. Target, 0. All the big businesses are doing fine. The little guys, they've been forced to close, and they're going out of business. Like, it's sad. It's sad. But, the year of Jubilee is there to protect small business. There's nothing wrong with big business, but you need healthy small businesses as well. And so it's going to prevent communist revolutions. It's going to prevent a lot of things that we're seeing there. So we'll pick that up next time with this. So let's all stand and we'll close in prayer.